Hello, and thanks for having me here again. My name is Johannes Ullrich. I'm the Dean of Research for the SANS Technology Institute College. And what I want to talk a little bit about is, well, our upcoming event, SANSFIRE. We are actually celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Internet Storm Center. And we'll do a lot about the history also of Internet Storm Center and sort of what preceded it. Internet Storm Center actually, well, wasn't known as Internet Storm Center until about 2002. Before that, we did call it a couple different names. Well, you'll actually learn more at our ISC keynote about some of the history. We have a bunch of special events there. We have a couple of our ISC handlers on site. Two of them will be actually teaching classes live at SANSFIRE. Xavier and Boyan will be teaching classes. And yeah, I have here actually my first SANSFIRE shirt. As I always say, this was before there were years. We didn't really put years on the shirts until later. I believe this was 2002 in Boston when we sort of had our first SANSFIRE. And there's a little challenge. If you have this shirt or an earlier shirt, let me know. And if you bring it to SANSFIRE, we'll definitely raffle off some honeypot or such. So bring your oldest shirt base that you have, particularly if it's a SANSFIRE shirt. And talking about honeypots, we will have a honeypot workshop. Also, a few honeypots we'll be giving away during that workshop, where we sort of go through setting it up and how to actually use the data from it, what you can learn from it. Now, just want to sort of, with a little view on history, talk a little bit about what we're seeing now in these honeypots and sort of how that relates to some of the prior things that we're seeing. So one of the URLs that I like on the page the most to really sort of see what's currently going on is this, what I call the first seen URL page. See the URL up here, also the QR code will link you directly to it. And it has this feature, you can search. And if you search for not categorized, you actually get a lot of the newer events that we haven't really sort of put into a category yet. Now, sometimes it's just because they're not well defined, so it's really hard to put them in a category. Like if you look at some of these here, these sort of bundle config.json, config.go, they're probably some kind of information leakage where they're trying to look at some configuration file, but not really sort of well defined yet, where we haven't really put it into a particular category yet. But you also, can see a few new things, new sort of an exciting thing. So when you, for example, look at our diaries, like earlier today, I wrote one about brute forcing of VPNs. That's sort of how I found out about it. That, hey, there are some new actors that are looking to brute force VPNs. Brute forcing VPNs, a big deal these days. And that, of course, is something that you will learn about, that you'll find out about, that there's something new that's sort of going around using this particular page. Now, one of the early events, actually, that sort of affected and we saw in Internet Storm Center, maybe not the very first, but one of the sort of early big ones, there were like two big events, Nimda and Code Red. All sort of early 2000-ish kind of when they came out. Two IIS exploits against an information server. Now, these were against the server itself. These days, when we're looking at this honeypot data, we are dealing with exploits against applications running on our web servers. Back then, it was still the web server itself that was actually sort of one of the big problems, like in these Nimda and Code Red attacks that we had. So, for example, this is the brute forcing that I wrote about today. Interesting password collection that we saw here. You see sort of here, there's 12356A and then sort of a special character. They're definitely sort of trying to, for example, hit some of the lazy compliance, where you do have people that try to find a password that's easy to remember and still complies with the number, letter, special character rules that some people put up here. Robert and Jason was the two usernames they tried. If anybody knows why they tried these particular usernames, let me know. But kind of a little bit odd that they just picked those two names. They picked many, many different passwords, but those two usernames they picked. And these are some of the interesting insights we get here. Now, if you look at the URL itself, that special character is URL encoded. That's this %2-1. That was actually with the Code Red attack that I mentioned earlier. One of the problems that IIS didn't deal correctly with these URL encoded parameters, and that led to a directory traversal attack. That's actually another sort of class of attacks that we do see a lot. And Jason Lamb will actually, by the time this video comes out, you may see a video from Jason Lamb about just directory traversal attacks in our Cloud and AppSec kind of YouTube channel. So you may want to take a look at that as well. This case, the URL encoding is not really a problem. It's really sort of the feature it's supposed to be in order to encode some of these special characters. So another vulnerability that last week hit was the checkpoint information leakage. This is one of these vulnerabilities. We had a few of them in some security devices. There was like one where you could, for example, access session IDs, and then you could impersonate users using those leaked session IDs. With the checkpoint information leakage, the root cause here actually is, again, directory traversal. I don't have the payload here. This is the URL that affects this particular vulnerability. Now, you see here, I searched for my CRL. That's the component that's being abused here. That's sort of the particular endpoint that's vulnerable. So on this first seen URL, if you learn about a new vulnerability like this, you can just search for a URL component like this and see, well, how many people are actually hitting that URL. Don't have a lot of hits for this. 33 counts, that's really not much for a particular date, but well, it's not zero, so people are definitely looking for it. The reason you don't see a ton of attacks for this particular URL is that what you get back tends to be sort of less automatable when it comes here to this particular vulnerability. One of the particular proof of concept exploits that was being demonstrated for this vulnerability leaked Etsy Shadow. Now, two things about Etsy Shadow. First of all, Etsy Shadow is where your passwords are on a Unix system, not in Etsy Password. Etsy Password only has the username. Etsy Shadow has the actual password hashes. Now, is that what you get back tends to be sort of less automatable when it comes here to this particular vulnerability. One of the particular proof of concept exploits that was being demonstrated for this vulnerability leaked Etsy Shadow. Now, two things about Etsy Shadow. First of all, Etsy Shadow is where your passwords are on a Unix system, not in Etsy Password. Etsy Password only has the username. Etsy Shadow has the actual password hashes. Now, on Checkpoint, they're reasonably well hashed, many iterations of SHA-256. So it will be quite difficult for an attacker to reverse and brute force those passwords unless a user uses an easy to guess password. And that's why this is sort of less automatable, this particular vulnerability. This is something where an attacker probably has to spend some time after they find a vulnerable system to actually then compromise that vulnerable system, at least at this point. Now, what was sort of interesting when I looked at this data a little bit further is on May 30th. May 30th is when Watchtower, a company that does publish research about vulnerabilities a lot, a great blog, by the way, where May 30th is when they sort of demonstrate a vulnerability. They put forward the proof of concept. How do you get access to Etsy Shadow? And well, we actually saw attacks against this URL the day before. This could be sometimes just a little bit of time zone thing where well, it was still after the blog was published, but we actually use UTC here as a time zone. So even if they published it like in Europe close to midnight on the 30th, it's still kind of significant that we did have attacks preceding the publication of this Watchtower blog. And you see how it sort of went up since then. Today, sort of, you have a little bit lower count just because not all the data is in yet and has not necessarily been processed yet. But this vulnerability, is definitely being exploited. And again, going a little bit sort of back at the history, password brute forcing and directory traversal, these are some of the early vulnerabilities that I remember looking at back in the day, like when we started with Internet Storm Center and its precursors, and when I started like the Shield around 2000. Those are the vulnerabilities that we basically deal with for the last 25 plus years and are still dealing with to a large extent. Another interesting issue here is etc shadow. Well, why do we have in Unix these two different files? We do have etc password and we do have etc shadow. The reason is that any user on a Unix system needs to know what other users are available. So etc password is world readable. Any user on the system is able to read etc password. That's why the sensitive information was removed from etc password and moved into the etc shadow file. etc shadow is only readable by root, because only root actually needs to verify if your password is correct when you enter it. So why does the web server have access to etc shadow? A web server should listen or should run as a unprivileged user. Often like a specific user like Apache or www.data is being used in order to lower the privileges and the capabilities of the web server. Well, that's sort of one thing that a lot of these security devices have in common, like VPNs, like firewalls that offer a web-based admin interface. In order for the web-based admin interface to do things like change network configurations, change firewall configurations, these web servers or the scripts being run by the web server often run with elevated privileges. There are better ways of doing this. And I talked a little bit about this earlier this week in a video that I put out about operating system command injection and such. You can sort of limit some of the privileges that a user has and or assign specific capabilities in Linux to particular scripts running on the system in order to just give them the privilege they need and not anything else. But many of these devices are, based on quite old software. Something like Checkpoint has been around pretty much as long as the Internet Storm Center for the last 25 years. So they run still a lot of that code, and that's why they don't always take advantage of the more modern ways how you solve some of these challenges, like running specific code with elevated privileges, but without really sort of giving away the entire system in case something gets compromised. We also had another sort of interesting event this week that sort of reminded me a little bit on the early days of the Internet Storm Centers. And this was a vulnerability with Cox Communications. Cox Communications is one of the larger, maybe even the largest cable modem provider in the United States. Comcast or Xfinity and Cox are probably sort of right up there together. And they had an API that, or still have an API that allow them to manage their cable modems on their consumer side. Well, Sam Curry, they came up with a vulnerability in the API that Cox used, basic authentication bypass vulnerability that basically allowed anybody who knew the right endpoints at that API to not only retrieve information about Cox Communication subscribers, but also adjust their cable modem settings and even their firmware. Sam actually came across this issue by finding an odd behavior of their own cable modem. The problem was whenever Sam went out to a non-HTTPS URL, from their cable or from their home system that went through that cable modem. Well, shortly after, a random host at DigitalOcean, the big hosted server provider, hit that same URL. And that was odd. Like, that URL was not at all associated with Cox. When Sam contacted Cox, Cox had no idea really what happened or why that would happen. They kind of, I guess, brushed it off a little bit as to what happened. Sam just went ahead and swapped their modem out for a new one. And Cox was happily willing to do that. But of course, with that, it wasn't really possible to investigate further what may have happened to the modem or may not have happened to the modem. Well, Sam then poked a little bit around in Cox's systems and came across that API, and then sort of inferring that the vulnerability in that API may have been used to compromise the cable modem, and that the cable modem had some kind of a packet sniffer or something like this installed that recorded these URLs and then allowed someone else to access those same URLs. Of course, with HTTPS, that necessarily would not work. Back in the old days, like, actually one of the things that inspired me a little bit to start like the Shield and later in Storm Center and such, was that when I got my first cable modem, this was like mid-90s, it was way back in the day, when I plugged in my Windows system into the cable modem, that, well, I actually saw my neighborhood. Network neighborhood in Windows was literally my neighborhood. Back then, they didn't even isolate different customers connected to the same cable modem. So you could see your neighbor's system that they had connected to the cable modem. And talking about cable modems, just a little bit about how this sort of works and why this API is such a big problem. So this is kind of, very cartoonish, your cable modem, where on the one end of the cable modem, you have some kind of coax cable coming in, often called the HF, the high frequency side. So basically the signal coming in from the cable company. And what the cable modem really does is it translates that system in its simplest form to Ethernet, and IP then, of course, on top of that, to provide IP to your device that you're connecting to it. Now, these days, you would connect like a little router or something like this to your cable modem. Back in the day when I actually started with Internet Storm Center, and I'll tell you that story at the keynote, but there was no D-Link Linksys. They didn't exist back then. So I actually had to build my own little router to do things like NAT and connect multiple systems to the cable modem. These days, of course, you often have these two devices merged, where Comcast, for example, offers sort of a cable modem that has Wi-Fi and a router built in. It's nice to the consumer because you just plug it in and it hopefully will work. It's nice for Comcast and any other ISP to provide systems like this, because of course a lot of times people complain about slow connectivity, and the reason they complain about it is not because the cable modem system is bad or something wrong, but their Wi-Fi or the router they're using has a problem. And by having it all in one device that's managed by the ISP, they have an easier time debugging it and helping out the consumer. But the problem here is, if all of this is one device, and this device is managed by your ISP, then of course, if an attacker now gains a hold of that API at Cox, well, they have full control over your network. Once they install malware on that device, they can scan your internal network, and they can attack systems inside your network, not just listen on traffic going in and out of your network. Even if you provide your own cable modem, many ISPs, cable ISPs, do offer where you are providing your own cable modem. Usually, you get a little bit of discount or so if you do that. But even if you do that, the ISP will still upload their custom firmware to your cable modem in order to ensure that it's compatible with their systems. And that's actually part of the DOCSIS standard that defines cable modems, that cable modems that are compatible with the standard have to allow this upload of firmware, not just configuration, but the entire firmware image is typically provided by the ISP, and the modem is flashed with that firmware as soon as you plug it in. So your best bet is not to have sort of a combined device, but a cable modem that's nothing but a cable modem, something simple as I displayed here. 2 plugs, one for the coax cable, one for your Ethernet cable, and then everything plugs into the firewall that you're providing. And of course, anything beyond that firewall, including that cable modem, whether you own it or not, is actually then considered hostile. And sort of if you avoid these all-in-one modems, because then you don't really have that control over what's actually going on in the network. Now, there's also an interesting protocol that is coming to play here, TR069. And I don't think it's with my camera, but behind me, I do have like years ago, we sort of looked at some TR069 exploits, actually. This is a protocol that's also used with DSL. It's not just a cable modem protocol, where the modem listens on port 7547. It should only listen for commands coming from specific IP addresses that your ISP owns, but sometimes they're left wide open. And yes, then you basically have attackers sort of trying to reconfigure your devices that way. And yeah, behind me, I have like a little DSLAM, sort of a little DSL head-end system. Was playing with this years ago when this was actually a bigger issue than now. But maybe with Cox, I have to look back at it again. There was another ISP in Arkansas, I think Windstream is its name, if I remember correctly, that also last year lost, like within 24 hours, about 600,000, I think it was 60,000, and I think it was more 100,000 of devices that were actually maliciously flashed with bad firmware that actually bricked those devices. They had to physically exchange those devices, which was a major pain, major cost for that particular ISP to get all of that worked out. And sadly, it was never really sort of identified, as far as I know, what was the root cause here, whether it was some kind of weak password. We often had that with sort of these TR69 attacks, where but a device would just have a weak password, and that could be used to alter the configuration. But anyway, so this is just, I pulled it up earlier today. The traffic we're seeing here at the Storm Center, again, against port 7547. And you see it's a pretty steady sort of background hum, as I usually call it, of attacks that are hitting that port. So the attackers certainly have not forgotten about attacking the port. I have to take a closer look to see what exact attacks they're sending, but I bet they're still sending these TR commands to really send new configurations, flash firmware, or to other interesting things with your device. And this is, again, something you as an end user have really no control over. This is something your ISP has to fix. Maybe the best thing you can do is do like a port scan of your public IP address from somewhere outside your ISP's network, and also from somewhere inside your ISP's network. Maybe a neighbor, a friend who use the same ISP, and see if you see any of these ports listening, like 7547 or some of the web admin ports that are often used by these devices. I've seen this with Comcast sometimes, where if you're connecting from inside the Comcast network, you have access to some of these admin interfaces, but if you connect from outside the Comcast network, you don't have access. So it's a little bit hit and miss depending on the particular local configuration. But anyway, that's sort of what I have for you as a quick update from the Storm Center. We did have a number of great diaries this week, last week, about some of these attacks, like the ones I mentioned, some of these videos about SQL injection, OS command injection. So if you're interested, isc.sans.edu. Also, if you have any questions, my email address is here. The QR code will link you to various other social media pages of mine that you can connect with me, depending on what your social media preference is. And hope to see many of you at SANSFIRE. I think it'll be a great conference, and can't wait to see what we will do with like all the honeypot stuff and such that we have set up, and some of the ways how we are trying to include sort of the Internet Storm Center data into the actual sort of live event. Thank you.